Just Incredible!
Yeah, hip-hop, baby. Just Incredible's freestyle series. Power 106, the king is in the motherfucking building.
You dig?
Oh, my brother's here to set a tone.
Hey.
Bars is in season.
Now, I ain't did this shit in quite some time.
I know, my brother.
Yeah, it's time to knock the dust off.
Honored to have you on the show today.
Man,
shout out to my brother B Nice, executive producing this one. Hey,
okay.
T.I.'s here to go crazy on y'all.
Hey.
Facts. Only right here, baby. Let's lift off on these motherfuckers,
Hey.
Tip. Come on.
Yeah. Okay.
Just Incredible.
Okay.
King.
Let's see here. Well, fuck a player hater. I'm a mayor maker. Out in LA laid up, live life like I'm ghost on takers. Know I'm staying with it. I ain't even gotta post no paper. Mansion, riverfront on acres. That's what prayer take you. Swear these niggas clueless, but they bitch you get it. They call me little dude till I hit them with it. Come on. I like a toes pink and that booty sitting. I like them titties itty bitty with them nipples pretty.
Come
the
on.
realest niggas in the city except no substitution. Can't be no reason with no demons, ain't no resolution. So no more conversation and ain't no hesitation.
Yes.
Sometimes the only way is straight decapitation.
Yes.
See, nigga be capping hard without no validation. Nigga better pump your brake before I fuck up your calibration. When they can't get you with the truth, they come with allegations. Fuck that shit, just tell my lawyer where to allocate my paper, mergers, acquisition. Double R's and Bentley, they know one thing about tipping. I penthouse my bitches. Might hate my gut, but still can't say nothing bad about my pimping. Survive bloody summer, still end up running number. Okay, my land is strong, money long, ain't no capping that. Man, I got stocks of different options, I don't have to rap. Ain't going back and forth with people, none of that. If you hear bullshit, you believe it, we'll just leave it where it's at. Won't see me complaining, I'ma make a way, and that's a fact. Won't be participating in no broke shit, had enough of that. I seen the whole world turn against me, niggas switched up, won't forget. So when you see me, I ain't speaking, don't be reaching for no help. Ryan Blicky in my lap, try me gon' get pout. Disrespect me, better find an exit ASAP. Work the chair, living on the edge, stuck on the lid, the way it go is high player, so fucked up in the head, cause I got strivers roll down to my sock, then my yacht gear. Pussy nigga hating on the net, we do not hear. Let's they talking about the kids, nigga, let it stop there. Playing with my top, yours, I'ma put a dot there.
Come on.
Pull a Magic City parking lot with a hot pair, 69 drop, popping out, make a stop stare. Old dime a dozen ass nigga, you are not rare. Gotta call 12 cause you can't afford Glock fare. 21 years in this motherfucker, top tier. We are not peers, when we cheers, it is not beer. 21-7, that my motherfucking grandson. Always keeping on him, never seen him with a handgun.
Yes.
If I wanna throw a freak party, I could plan one. Never been no pressure, man, that pussy come in tandem. Random, I just gotta offer him from Landbank. London, either way you say a couple million when the plan done. Yeah, need a couple million for expansion. Yeah, take it to Jamaica, buy a mansion. Hit the distribution for extension. Overkill, lawyers say they talking around 10 some. Listen, I done did my thing, bitch, and then some. Critics try to leave me off the list like they forgetting some.
Crazy. Cook, T.I., cook.
Man, let me see here.
You blacking out, baby.
Let me see here, man.
A lot of your favorite rappers have gone ghost right now.
Let me see some.
T.I.'s here, though, with the bars tonight.
Yeah, man. Just incredible, man. Freestyle series. Let's see what we got.
My brother. Let's
up.
go get him.
They call me narcissistic. I call it persistent. Lord, forgive me if I seem off a distant. But when I ain't have a pot to piss in, wasn't no arm extended. I had to get out there and get it. So if you see me with it, it came from executing this vision. I pay no attention to niggas who go outside the code, do whole shit, go against it.
Yeah.
No mention of reconciliation. I got no intention. I don't do petty, just big business. I got no incentive. But you won't live rent free in my thoughts. I grant you no admission. May God bless and block the demon, try to torment me. I pray for peace and understanding and a loaded cannon. Then someone else instead of hand unless they freeze and panic.
Nice.
Then guess I have to take my chance and nigga be in their feelings. Like they wearing panties, don't know when to end they send it. Where the conversation going? You gon' owe a big percentage. Time and money, won't every penny. Should be in the guinea for my pussy pumping and spinning. It did work trip to Venice. Nigga, yours ain't worth the trip to Dennis. I'm talking tennis necklace. Full booger with VVS is different big investment. No broke shit in my presence. Introduce me to a peasant. I consider you a peasant. Fuck off. Just the king, bitch.
Let them know, baby.
Just incredible, man. Freestyle series. It's been a while since I did this shit. I just wanted to see if I still had it.
Nah, my brother up here just working out, working the muscles out, man.
You feel me? Stretching my leg.
Hey, T.I., thank you for doing that tonight, man.
Man, ain't nothing but some love and respect.
Big love, my brother.
Yeah, grand hustle shit.
Grand hustle shit. Just incredible hip-hop shit, man.
Yeah, that way.
Hey, shout out to... I love the Dr. Dre beat, man.
You did.
Long live Nipsey
What's good, everybody? Y'all know what time it is? Reading time. Can I get a mic check? I know y'all got places to go and people to do. Can I get that uno dose? Yeah, Tap, I was in meetings by the time you called me back, man. You know, I was just checking in on you, big dog. Just doing my brotherly check-in, man. Just seeing what's so good with you, man. I'll call you back this before the week's out, bro. Just checking on my brothers. So let's get into it, man. Y'all know we here. It's Wednesday night. That meaning it's book club. I have picked out the next book. It's the Moynihan Reports. Again, we'll dive into it deeper once I get the book. I already ordered on Amazon today, so it should be here by next week. Our next book is going to be the Moynihan Reports. We do have a laptop giveaway coming up, brand new laptop giveaway. So make sure that you are 1, subscribe to the channel, 2, that you have that notification bell on, and 3, that you're in the chat when I do a live show, because it will be subscribers that are in the chat that can win. So make sure you're here, right? It might be a chat where there's a lot of people here. It might be a live that there's a lot of people here. It might be a live when there's a little people here. What's good, Smitty? How you doing? So let's get into the reading. Let's run the news clip, and then we'll get to this reading, guys. Hold up. And I pray y'all having a great week, man. I pray everything is well with you, not just you, but as well as your families and your loved ones. And I pray for the people who don't like me too, so y'all still in there.
Norah Mary Vincent was an American writer. She was a weekly columnist for the Los Angeles Times and a quarterly columnist on politics and culture for the national gay and lesbian news magazine, The Advocate. She was a columnist for The Village Voice and Salon.com. Her writing appeared in The New Republic, The New York Times, The New York Post, The Washington Post, and other periodicals. She gained particular attention in 2006 for her book, Self-Made Man, detailing her experiences when she lived as a man for 18 months. The experience led Vincent to have a nervous breakdown, and she fell into a deep depression. Nora was a radical feminist who believed that men had a much easier life than women. She set out to prove that hypothesis by disguising herself as a man for 2 years. In her book about the experience, she explains that she actually learned that men have it harder. In fact, the experience was so bad, she had to stop at 18 months because she was starting to hate women due to how badly the women treated her when they thought she was a man. Vincent also stated that she had gained more sympathy and understanding for men and the male condition. Men are suffering. They have different problems than women have, but they don't have it better. They need our sympathy, they need our love, and they need each other more than anything else. They need to be together. Nora died by assisted suicide at a clinic in Switzerland on July 6, 2022, aged 53. Her death was not reported, however, until August 2022.
That's the background to the foreground. We are on chapter 7, Self. That's ELF. We are on page 228. Shout out to my boy Tap with the $10 bar. I appreciate you, God. Thank you so much. $1 a dime. I appreciate your time, man. Thank y'all so much for supporting the channel and rocking with me. Theo in the building. How you doing, my guy? What's popping? Average man. How you doing, bro? What's good? What's good? What's good, man? Let's get to this read, man. I got y'all for about an hour. It's 8:22. Let's see how much we can get through today. We're on chapter 7, Self. The poet and translator Robert Bly ignited the modern men's movement in the United States in 1990 with the publication of his book, Iron John. In it, Bly identified what he saw as a crisis of identity in American manhood, caused largely by the prevalence of broken relationships between fathers and sons, the disappearance of male initiation rituals, and a dearth of male role models for young boys. using myth and fairy tales as his guides, especially the Grimm's brother story, Iron John, from which the book takes its title. Bly encouraged men to reconnect with the buried wild man inside them as a means of healing their bereft and wounded souls. Men, he argued, had gone through a painful evolution in recent decades, moving from one broken model to the next. First, there was the 50s man who was supposed to like football, be aggressive, stick up for the United States, never cry, and always provide. But he was callous and brutal, isolated and dangerous. Then came the 60s man, beset by guilt and horror over the Vietnam War, and encouraged by the early feminist movement to get in touch with his feminine side. So y'all see what it sounded like, right? Bly praised this new gentle, thoughtful man for leaving behind the crusty stoicisms of his father's generation, but lamented his eventual deterioration into the 70s man, or what Bly called the soft man, a man without backbone or force, an unhappy man, more compassionate than the 50s man, but out of touch with vital, fierce parts of his masculinity. In Bly's reading of the Grimm tale, Iron John, passive, fearful men have the courage to reclaim their essential manhood by literally dragging up this lost fierceness and vitality from inside them, just as the young men in the Grimm story dredge up hairy, muddy Iron John from the bottom of a swamp. Iron John, or the symbolic wild man, scary, unkempt, and ugly as he may seem, is, said Bly, the key to the man's self-actualization and freedom, the way forward in men's lives. Iron John became a national bestseller, and though Bly and others had been leading private men's workshops, but let's go back, right? Which sounds more like which man sounds more in line with the Iron John? Is it the man of the 50s that she mentioned, or is it the man of the 70s? Is it the man that was at war? Right? Y'all remember the World War, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, right? Was it the man that was at war? That's supposedly the ones in the 50s? Or was it the man that was in the 60s and 70s that's more relatable to the Iron John connection or comparison, I should say? In Bly's reading of the Grimm tale, Iron John, passive, fearful men must have the courage to reclaim their essential manhood by literally dredging up the lost fierceness and vitality from inside them, just as the young men in the Grimm story dredge in hairy, muddy Iron John from the bottom of a swamp. Iron John, or the symbolic wild man, scary, unkempt, and ugly as he may seem, is, said Bly, the key to men's self-actualization and freedom, the way forward in men's lives. Okay, I read that already. Iron John became a national bestseller, and through Bly and others had been leading private men's workshops throughout the 1980s. The book brought this work and its stated purpose to public consciousness. New men's workshops and organizations have since sprung up across the country and the world. When I started this project, I had heard of Bly and Iron John and the men's movement, but I had no idea what men did or talked about at these secret meetings. Women aren't allowed to attend them, and the men who attend are generally secretive about what goes on. Like the monastery, there was another shuttered male world that I thought might offer me valuable insights into the male experience and men's struggles to redefine themselves in this post-feminist age. But unlike the monks, the men who joined these groups were facing their problems, talking about them openly and pointedly examining their masculinity, both as they and the culture defined it, It was the perfect place to end Ned's journey. Mr. He Said in the building. Make sure y'all subscribe to Conscious Parent, promoting conscious parenting over there on YouTube. Also, Mr. He Said and Mrs. She Said on YouTube and Instagram and all those good places you like to go. What's good, my brother? How you doing, God? Peace to you. I chose an intimate group of about 25 to 30 guys that met once a month. I had to travel about an hour and a half each way by car to get to the meetings, which were held in a rented rehearsal room in a community center. The room itself was the size of a small dance studio, bare except for a piano in the corner and mirrors on 2 of the walls. We sat in folding chairs arranged in a circle in the center of the room. There, just sitting and listening, I thought I was going to coast through the end of Ned's Odyssey in a cozy, therapeutic setting. Little did I know that this last leg of the trek would push me to the breaking point. It's about to get spicy. I went to my first meeting in mid-July, the worst time of the year for Ned to try to pass at close quarters in a poorly air-conditioned, brightly lit room. I was dabbing my face constantly with a handkerchief to avoid beer slippage. Add to that the special notice I got for being the new guy, and you can imagine why I was sweating profusely from the moment I walked in. I had been hoping to sneak in and sit in the back unnoticed, but the group hadn't seen a newcomer in some time. So Gabriel, one of the group's longest-standing members, introduced me around the room. Gabriel was sweet. Heartbreaking, really. The minute you met him, you can see that his sense of self was in pieces all over the floor. Wait a minute.
Did you hear what I said?
Gabriel was sweet. Heartbreaking, really. The minute you met him, you can see that his sense of self was in pieces all over the floor. Like a motorcycle someone had taken apart in a garage years before and hadn't been able to put back together again. So is she saying that women can recognize these traits in men, that a man is broken, that a man is strong, or at the very least has the presentation of that? Just a question. He was handsome in an earnest, outdoorsy sort of way. Mid-40s, but still dirty blonde and trim in his jeans, long sleeve t-shirts, and Birkenstocks. He was harmless and well-meaning, but a little off-putting at first in his eagerness to bond with me as a brother. On my second visit, he insisted on hugging me hello and goodbye. I'm not generally a big one for therapy groups, especially cultish ones that circulate mimeograph booklets full of toothless mantras and aphorisms, or erudite poetry that's supposed to sound deep but usually isn't. This group was a classic of that genre, at least in its literature. It had its own mimeograph booklet, which one of the founding members had assembled, and it was full of quoted snippets from the men's movement gurus like Bly, Joseph Campbell, and Michael Meade, as well as a few scattered gems from Yeats, Eliot, Emerson, and other dead poets of note. But to me, in this context, even the master sounded flaccid and ill-used. The rest of the booklet consisted mostly of questions that were supposed to function as loose guidelines for discussions on that meeting's assigned theme. Questions like, what are my unmet emotional needs? How much is my masculinity defined by other people or society's expectations of me? Do I respect other men? There were several themes or stages of growth in all. Instead of the usual 12 that recurred in addiction recovery meetings, like a 12-step group, we rotated through them from week to week. When we finished stage 7, we begin again the next time at stage 1. Call me unevolved, but I didn't want to hug anybody there. I'm sorry, call me uninvolved, but I didn't want to hug anybody there just because it was part of the program. I don't do program. I don't like program, even though I know people who participate in them and have changed their lives immensely for the better as a result. I wanted to hug people when I felt something for them, when I was ready. Besides, I saw myself as the enemy in this group, and I thought it best to keep it that way. That says a lot. I'm going to leave that for y'all to unpack. But hugging was central to the therapy there. Most men don't tend to share much physical affection with their male friends. So here the guys made a point of hugging each other long and hard at every possible opportunity as a way of offsetting what the world had long deprived them of and what they in turn had been socialized to disallow themselves, right? Right. Again, you are uncomfortable with seeing men what women do in a communal setting, right? Y'all ever see a bunch of girlfriends when they first get together? Oh, girl, it's hugs, it's hugs, it's hugs, it's hugs, right? Everybody hugging. It's like it's a hug fest, right? Everybody got to take turns hugging. Then it's a group hug, and then everybody got to take pictures. Right? It's just what they do. It's cool. It wasn't at all uncommon at the beginning and end of these meetings to see pairs of guys engaging in prolonged hugs. Sometimes they'd be crying. Sometimes they'd be just shoring each other up with reassuring words. Even as someone who's seen and never been startled by the sight of a lot of gay men hugging each other long and tenderly in public, it took me a while to get used to seeing these straight men hugging this way. They were really holding each other, taking care. And this just isn't something you see very often in the outside world. Ned hadn't seen it in his. And when you saw these guys doing it, it made you realize how badly they needed this surrogate brotherly fatherly love and how much they needed it to be expressed physically. Here we go. These men have been making do all their lives with traditional nods of solid understanding. But that wasn't enough anymore. The monks, or some among them, perhaps influenced by the men's movement, had been savvy enough to figure this out. But it's not the kind of thing you can force, especially when you're trying to reverse a lifetime's worth of programming. These guys were here because they wanted to be. And though during my time with them, there was always a part of me that remained uncomfortable with groupthink, self-help in this case, I had to admire the effort. I knew enough men who could have used similar help. If only they could have opened a pinhole in their defenses. Who was I to scorn this medicine, even if its bywords weren't to my liking? Gas mask in the building. What's good, bro? How you doing? How you doing? Thanks for coming through. The meetings always started out the same way most AA and other 12-step meetings begin, with one of the members reading from the designated portion of the booklet, then giving a 5 to 10 minute speech to the group on the topic of the evening. Usually, this was a fairly rambling affair, full of expressed discomfort with the whole endeavor. None of these guys were particularly eager to get up front of a room full of other men and tell them how he felt. As one of the guys said, it was a feat for him to realize that he even had feelings. Learning to identify and express them, especially in the presence of other men, was asking a lot. To me, this was amazing. The idea that a person could be incapable of expressing his emotions. Identifying and expressing my emotions had usually come fairly easy to me. It had never occurred to me that some people not only didn't do it, but didn't have the slightest notion of how to do it. This, I now realize, is a highly privileged, largely feminine point of view, and one whose value and comparative rarity Ned has since made me appreciate. To my mind, and it was clear from what these guys were saying, to their minds as well, living your whole life without connecting to your emotions could be as detrimental to the spirit as starvation is to the body. And though hearing about this handicap came as something of a revelation to me when I heard these men talking about it so candidly. It shouldn't have, since it was only a confirmation of what I found at the monastery and elsewhere in the world as Ned. A lot of men were chronically caught incommunicado. After this initial outpouring to the group, the speaker would step down and the groups would split up into smaller discussion circles of 3 or 4s. The smaller discussion groups, which lasted nearly an hour, functioned like co-counseling workshops. These were usually the dark heart of the meetings, the intimate times when breakthroughs could be made. For me, they were usually just times to learn more about the core issues. The specifically gender-related problems these guys shared in common and hashed out together. I often sat aloof, just taking mental notes. It was in one of these small discussion groups that I had my first conversation with Paul. It happened several months after I started going to the meetings. I'd met him very briefly once before, early on, but he intimidated me. And so I kept the contact to a brief hello, terrified that he would see through Ned immediately. I had heard about him from other members, about his problems with rage, but also about his perceptiveness and intelligence. I thought I should be very careful around him. I said to myself, if anyone will sniff you out, he will, and it won't be pretty when he does. I was afraid of him. He was a powerful looking man, probably in his late 50s, no taller than 5'9", but heavy with solid arms, large hands, and a sizable paunch, which he wore like a sumo. And if it would been an asset in a fight, not a liability. As if it would be an asset in a fight, not a liability. My apologies. He probably couldn't move very fast, but he looked as if he could crush you with a single blow. He had the bloated, toughened face of an Irish boxer or a corrupt old world cop, and his whole head, woolly with his russet grain hair, looked like a wad of scar tissue. Even though he scared me a little, as the godfather of the group and the leader of its biannual retreats, Paul was fascinating to me too. As much as I wanted to avoid him for fear of being found out, I always wanted to know his story, to pick him apart. I saw him as a self-styled neo-pagan guru with a ragtag pack of foundlings whimpering at his heels. I couldn't help thinking of it that way at first, and disliking Paul for the petty tyranny he seemed to exercise over these men. It wasn't hard to dominate the group. These were mostly broken people, and as much as Paul may indeed have been out to help his fellow men, his brothers, as they called each other, he was, I thought, probably also in it for the bi-monthly adulation. Plus, one weekend a year, he got to go into the woods with drums and hatchets and play Colonel Kurtz, spouting his aphoristic horrors to his followers and roasting a fall on the fire, or some such. I didn't know what they did on those weekends, but I wasn't going to go find out. To me, he seemed dangerous on some level, volatile at least. And what I was doing was invasive to his pet project, or could be. The rage it could provoke in him might be considerable. It would press all his buttons. As he told it, one of the defining conflicts of his psyche was his hatred for his mother, who he said had been psychotic. She was dead now and had tried to kill him. He said he had scars to prove physical abuse at her hands. I imagine that Paul had transformed his abiding hatred for this woman into a pervasive and virulent misogyny. His response to me, if he found me out, especially if he found me out in the woods with all of what I supposed to be his sharpened instruments at hand, could, I thought, easily turn nasty. I could see it happening, all the matrophobic ire finding its focal point in me, the treacherous female, nosing her way in where she didn't belong, listening to the secrets and invading their sacred spaces. Of course, none of this was fair, I didn't even know the man yet. But Paul was emblematic for me from the start. This was the end of Ned's journey, and Paul was the last trial, the last person to deceive and perhaps confront. I wanted to make it easy for myself to dislike him because it was going to make me feel a lot less guilty about spying on him. Posting him out there somewhere as my nemesis in effigy made him neatly detestable in my mind. Besides, the way he presented himself on a first or second meeting didn't help his cause. He seemed gruff and egocentric, even a little belligerent when he spoke, spitting his words like a preemptive strike. Sounds like somebody I know. The first time I heard him address the group, he specified with self-important authority. He condescended, almost angrily, as if he were a principal lecturing truants. He said, "Someone said about me recently, Paul thinks he's the center of the universe. And I say, if you're not the center of the universe, there's something wrong. You are the center of your universe, because if you're not, who is?" He went on to talk about the need for each man to respect other man's egos. This made the feminist in me bristle at first. Haven't we had enough of men's egos, I thought? But then I remember my first night out in drag in the East Village and my perception that respecting one another's egos was exactly what men were often doing with their eyes and their body language, slipping past one another's protected zones with minimal engagement. It wasn't about pride so much as protection. As F reading my thoughts, Paul said, "When you look another man in the eye, it means one of two things." What? He waited for a reply. I was ready with the answer. "I want to fuck you or I want to kill you," I said. Everyone turned to look at me. "Exactly," said Paul. "I want to fuck you or I want to kill you." But in Paul's rendering, there was more to it. He was making a larger point, a point that was central to the purpose and mythology of the men's movement. But I didn't find that out until much, much later, until I heard more of these men's stories and learned what they were trying to accomplish at these meetings. At the time, it just made me think that Paul was a petty, tough guy, showing his homemade troops how to piss in all four corners of the room. But then Paul and I met again in one of the small discussion groups. We were sitting 2 feet from each other, face to face, and he wasn't in abstraction anymore. Nor, I soon discovered, was he the bully I'd taken him for. I sat quietly for the first half hour, just as I usually did, listening to what the other guys were saying. He was listening too, and as I listened and watched the way he listened, I began to see that there was much more to him than the illusion of certainty he presented at the front of the room. He wasn't just a windbag who loved the sound of his own voice. Actually, he was the only man in the group who really listened. He listened intently instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. Most of the other guys tend to talk at and past each other, rarely to or with each other. They listened, it seemed, mostly for things that reinforce their own experience or point of view about themselves. They'd nod when something resonated, but then as soon as the speaker finished, they'd often just launch into their own story, relevant or not. This ship passing in the night approach didn't seem to bother most of the guys, probably because they were so unused to talking this frankly about their feelings. A mere airing was good enough. They weren't practiced at the art of give and take. But Paul was. He actually responded to what you said. He'd ask you a follow-up question, probe you a bit to make you examine your thoughts. He'd interact. This, coupled with his intelligence and depth, stood out markedly in this company. It almost made me want to participate. Almost. And that's what happened that night. Paul drew me in and drew me out. He turned his chair around, as he often did in meetings, and he folded his arms on the chair's backrest, propping his chin on one fist. He looked me right in the eye and wouldn't look away. I'd been silent all evening, but there was no denying that look. It said, "So, what's your story?" Drew Titan in the building. What's good, my guy? Peace to you guys. Make sure y'all subscribe to Drew Titan LLC. That means he's about his business here on YouTube. Also, he also has another podcast channel. Make sure y'all subscribe to that. God damn, I just had a brain fart. Put it in the chat. The painful podcast. Make sure y'all subscribe. Drew, put it in the chat, bro. I'm sorry. Getting old, man. I'm getting old. It said, "So what's your story?" I'm in a very bad mood, I said. I don't think I'm going to say anything helpful. Hold on, y'all. My baby coming. Thank you, Pop. Love you. Look at you, baby. Thank you. My old lady, y'all. Anger isn't helpful, he prompted, fixing me more intently. A good point. This came up often in the group. The idea that anger was not an unproductive emotion if followed to its source. The way these guys told it, anger was the one emotion they had in abundance, the one emotion that the world had allowed them to have in abundance. So by implication, it contained everything else: sorrow, pain, need, shame, you name it. It was a feeling they knew well, and it was the place where most of their other feelings hid. Nobody here was going to judge you for letting it speak. Because that I feel so wrong about that, Drew. Hold on, man. Painful Excellence. Thank you. God damn, Ricky, you slow as shit. The Painful Excellence podcast here on YouTube. He has some really great thought-provoking discussions. Make sure y'all subscribe to my boy. Great content creator, man. Great dude, man. That's it right there. That's it right there. It's in the chat. It's in the chat. It's in the chat. Okay. A good point. This came up often in the group. I said that already, blah, blah, blah. This was refreshing, actually, and I thought particularly masculine. I and most of the women I knew had been sublimating anger for as long as we could remember. It was the one emotion we weren't quite allowed or didn't allow ourselves. Eschewing it was part of being nice and attractive. You didn't want to be thought of as a bitch, so you put it all underground or turned it on yourself. TBE, I see you, man. What's good? With these guys, I like taking it in the face for a change. Hearing anger spoken out loud in no uncertain terms. I had people venting spleen without apology in harsh and cutting words. They'd say things like, "I hate my sister," or they'll tell you in detail about how they fantasized about ripping their wife into tiny pieces. At one of the yearly retreats, for example, one guy had found it very therapeutic to pretend that he was chopping up his wife with an axe. This after he'd come home from a business trip to find that she left him and taken the kids with her. Paul said he got a wedding invitation from this guy a few years later. On it, the guy had scrawled a personal note saying that his second marriage would have been unthinkable without the healing he'd experienced on that retreat. Many of the guys in the group were not afraid to admit that they had murderous rage inside them. Some people said it outright. "I'm homicidal." Some said they knew there was a potential rapist in them. Not that any of these fantasized crimes ever came to pass or would. They were just talking, saying the worst things, letting out the worst thoughts, not always violent, but ugly, uncharitable thoughts. The kind of thoughts that, if most of us were honest, we'd admit we've had too, in some form or another. I respected their frankness. Of course, If you heard all of these wife mangling stories out of context, you'd misunderstand what was really going on. It would sound like motivational misogyny or some sick rallying cry for the authority. Does this sound familiar, guys? Does this sound familiar? But it was more complicated than that. The anger came from legitimate feelings. And the more time I spent with these guys, the more the underlying causes for these feelings took shape and actually vetted things I'd undergone or perceived as Ned. Many of them seemed linked to a common male experience. Sometimes, as with Paul, the anger and hostility these guys felt toward the women in their lives sprang from an unsurprising Freudian source. Their wives and girlfriends were often versions of their mothers. They remembered their mother as being suffocating, omnipresent influences on whom they have felt humiliatingly dependent and from whom they were still desperately trying to get free. One guy in the group talked openly about this, and in his comments about his wife, you can hear the humor and pathos in his struggles. If I put on her underwear, I would drown. I couldn't live in her underwear. She's pretty big, and she really shouldn't try to live in mine. She doesn't have the balls. She's a woman. She doesn't have the balls. I try to detach, but the truth is that when I think I'm going to die, my wife's life flashes in front of my eyes instead of my own. There's still a little kid in me that still needs mommy very badly. I admit that. I even referred to her a few weeks ago as my mother instead of my wife. This push and pull with mommy, and hence with women in general, became even more tangled and ferocious when you factor in dads. Aside from having had and sometimes still having difficulties with their mothers, a lot of these guys had terribly strained and loaded relationships with their fathers. True to form, as I had also discovered in the monastery, the breakdown between father and son had happened largely as a result of the two men's culturally conditioned inabilities to communicate with each other. It was a curse that fathers had been handing down to sons for generations. Emotional remove, hypocritical expectations, silent judgment, abandonment. This had left populations of sons without role models, teachers, or guides to lead them through the tangled, confusing, and often painful processes of becoming a man. In groups with other men, these guys were trying to find the love that their fathers had been unable to give them, or possibly the love that the entire culture had conspired to keep men from giving each other. Again, like the monks, they had a profound need for other men's love. Love alone wasn't enough. They needed a man's affection and respect, a man's approval, and a man's shared perspective on their feelings. Having a mother or a woman's love just wasn't and could never be the same. It couldn't fill the hole. As Bly wrote in Iron John, only men can initiate men, as only women can initiate women. Women can change the embryo to a boy, but only men can change the boy into a man. Initiators say that boys need a second birth, this time a birth from men. This was the crucial and remarkable difference between the way guys felt about their mothers and fathers. They placed blame on both parties, but they actively mourned their fathers. They were seeking to reclaim and make peace with them. As for their mothers, it was mostly good riddance. In the context of this longing for male love, sometimes female love was all the more repugnant and enraging to them. Excuse me. Only serving to emphasize what was missing. We're going to page 242. What does it want? Paul asked me. What? You mean the anger? I said. Yeah, anger is always a deprivation. So what does it want? To be free free of expectations? Whose expectations? That would be an answer they could relate to and a true one. This would be an answer they could relate to and a true one. My father's, I said. The two other guys in my small circle nodded vigorously. They knew the tribulations of living up to a father's expectations. They had all shared similar feelings in heartwarming and heartbreaking language, though their burden was far heavier than mine's, mostly. As Bly has argued, because they were men. They had all shared similar feelings in heartbreaking language, though their burden was far heavier than mine, mostly. As Bly had argued, because they were men. Their fathers were their models for themselves in a way that mine wasn't and never could be. On a previous night, one of the guys in my circle had shocked me when he said, if only my father hadn't hated me so much, maybe we could have related. Another had talked of killing his father, taking revenge on the bastard for his childhood. A third, Josh had told the story of his father's recent death, his need to make peace with the man's legacy, and his inability to step into his father's vacant shoes. A few months after his father's death, Josh's mother had telephoned him and asked him to come to the family home and clean out his father's workshop. His father had been something of a master craftsman, and he had left behind a lot of tools, but Josh wasn't the type to work with his hands. You could tell that this must have been a sore point between his father and him, and probably part of what had kept them apart. Josh did go home to his father's workshop, just as his mother had asked him to. I touched the handle of his hammer, he said in a shaking voice. I went into the basement where there were rows and rows of his little drawers, full of screws and bolts and stuff, all carefully labeled. I couldn't face it. I couldn't take these things to my home and do what he had done with them. But then I thought maybe I could just take them out of their drawers and mix them all up together in a pile. Everyone laughed at this. We knew what he meant. An anarchist act, a rebellious last no to measuring up to dad. Children. Like Josh, my story was pretty vanilla. My father and I had never hated each other, but it seemed relevant, so I shared it with Paul when he asked. Here's the thing about my relationship with my dad when I was growing up, I said. He was a real stickler about intellectual pursuits, especially about grammar. He couldn't abide bad grammar. He still can't. He yells at the television to this day. But I wasn't particularly intellectual. I was a tree climber who couldn't sit still long enough to read a paragraph. I lived by intuition, and I wanted him to respond to me emotionally. That was my world, but he didn't really understand it. There was a disconnect between us for the reason, and we didn't communicate very well. If, for example, I had gone into his bedroom in the middle of the night and woken him up and said, Dad, it's me. The house is on fire. He would have said, it is I. The verb to be takes the nominative case. Then he would have rolled over and gone back to sleep. You really need to come to the retreat, said Paul, laughing. I was coming whether I needed to or not, though I was doing so without the slightest idea what to expect or how I was going to maintain my disguise. As I packed for the retreat, I grew increasingly anxious about making this trip. What if they found me out? What would they do? Was this a crazy idea? I was going up into the woods alone with a bunch of guys who thought I was a man and who had serious rage issues about women. They even talked about tearing women to pieces or chopping them up with axes. These were psychodramatic exaggerations. Yes, but so what? Anything could happen in the woods, right? Look what happened to Tina Brandon. She passed as a guy in rural Nebraska. And then when her so-called friends found out she was a woman, 2 of them raped her and murdered her. And what about Matthew Shepard? For the crime of being gay and being in the wrong bar at the wrong time, he was beaten senseless and left for dead hanging like a scarecrow from a fence in a Wyoming pasture. Whether I had reason to or not, I was starting to get scared. And on top of all this, there was the guilt. It was gaining on me too. Despite the intimate encounter Paul and I had just had, all my initial fears about him resurfaced. They got worse. In fact, My bad, yo. Now that we bonded in some way, I thought it likely that he'd be much angrier about the lie if he ever found it out. He showed me affection and concern. He'd been especially pleased to learn that I was coming to the retreat. I thought I actually heard tenderness in his voice. I tempered some of these worries by taking a few precautions. I made sure that my girlfriend knew where I'd be and with whom. She knew Paul's address and full name. I sent emails to friends giving them the same information. In case something awful happened, I figured the detectives would know where to start. The lodge was in a wooded area on a small lake. The leaves were in full color, and from a distance, the trees along the shoreline were like a quilt draped over the hills. When we arrived, the air was cool but humid, the day's rain having turned to fog. The property was elevated and secluded enough to be out of cell phone range, but not more than a few miles from the nearest village. This assuaged some of my fears about what I'd do in an emergency, but it would still be a long run down the dirt road in my underwear if it came to that. And somehow I didn't think the sight of tits and tidy whities would inspire much sympathy in the locals. Only one other structure shared the lakefront, and it was far enough away to be out of earshot. Hey, Miss Mary, how you doing, sis? Happy Wednesday. How are you? The main floor of our dwelling had a large communal dining room with 5 or 6 round tables, each of which seated 6 or 7. There was also one long rectangular table that could accommodate about 15 or 20. There was an industrial kitchen just off the dining room, worked by several amenable cooks for hire. Food service was included in the price of the trip. Also, on the main floor, leading off the dining room, was a large living room. Its main feature was an imposing floor-to-ceiling fieldstone fireplace in which a well-tended fire was always burning. On its mantle, Paul had placed the group's talismans, one of which was, lamentably enough, a large, crudely carved wooden penis. The rest of the room was filled with armchairs and sofas and a few folding metal chairs. Over the weekend, we conducted most of our talks and seminars in this room. I am well, my sister. I am well. Thank you so much for asking. The sleeping quarters were upstairs, 10 bedrooms in all, each of which could sleep 4 men in 2 sets of wooden bunk beds. As it happened, one of my bunkmates didn't show, so I had only 2 roommates to deal with instead of 3. Still, I can assure you that, given the way these guys snored and farted in their sleep, 2 roommates were quite enough. Through the walls, I could hear the guys in the next room roaring like wildebeest all night long. 33 men in all attended the retreat. Make that 32 men and 1 woman. It was a full house. I had planned on sleeping in my clothes and not showering, leaving my beard untouched and making good cover of filth if need to be. It was only going to be 2 days, and if I got covered in mud during that time, so much the better for disguise. I chose one of the bottom bunks, and I was able to disrobe there inside my sleeping bag. Once the lights had been turned out, I stripped down to my t-shirt and underwear, stashing my flannel shirt and jeans in the corner of my bunk, to be put on again in the same way at first light. The first night we arrived in the early evening and had dinner. The festivities began thereafter with an initiation ritual. This involved all 33 of us standing together in the main dining room in as tight a mass as we could manage. Paul encouraged this by laying a rope around us on the floor and tightening its circumference as much as possible around our feet. When we were packed together, Paul stood in front of us and told us what to do. This was a given throughout the weekend. Paul told us what to do, and we did it. The ritual we are about to undergo was called smudging, a Native American custom. It consisted of lighting a bowl full of incense, mostly sage from the smell of it, holding the bowl in front of each man and fanning him with the smoke. Bless you, baby. Bless you. Jeez Louise. Bless you. Up and down his body, both front and back, with what looked to be a fully feathered and preserved eagle or hawkswing. The idea, as Paul explained, was for each man, one by one, when he felt moved to do so, to step outside the circle, walk over to the smudger, raise his arms, and receive the smoke as it wafted around him. Per Paul's instructions, some of the guys had suspended a tarp from the ceiling, draping it over side of a rope so that it hung down in an A-frame and formed a tunnel. After you had been smudged, you were supposed to walk through the tunnel to what Paul had called an unknown beyond that awaited you in the next room. Paul went first, of course, because, as he explained somewhat arcly, in the wild, the alphas always get first dibs on the meat. He had an impish look in his eye, but he took this very seriously all the same. He stood in front of the smudger with his eyes closed. He had one hand over his heart and one hand over his prick, as if he was saying a pre-epic pledge of allegiance, which I guess in a way he was. I was one of the last to go through. When I stood in front of him, the smudger looked me in the eye and nodded gravely as he fanned me. I nodded back with my best square jaw and turned to enter the tunnel of unknowing. At the end of it, I encountered two obstacles, which Paul had said represented the obstacles one faces along the way to masculine enlightenment. The first obstacle was a bench that they had placed in the doorway. You had to step over it. The other was a low lintel, which you had to duck under in order to enter the next room. Ducking under had the effect of bringing you into the living room at half height. The action itself was pretty silly, but I understood its symbolism well enough. Coming into a room at half height puts you in a disadvantaged posture, one that I could imagine inspired considerable discomfort among these guys, especially when other guys were present. Some part of them was always thinking in terms of conflict and defense, especially around each other. As a guy, you had to be at your full height and in possession of your faculties when in close proximity to other men. I had learned this too, as Ned. It was complicated because on one level, everything was easy and brotherly, full of those inclusive hey buddy handshakes I had felt early on in my term as Ned and had felt here in the group as well. But all of this camaraderie depended on a strict observance of the rules. The boundaries were strong between men. And as I had learned at the monastery, you had to navigate them appropriately or risk a strong negative reaction. I could see why it was hard for these guys to let down their emotional defenses with each other. For me, as a woman with other women, the contact was always fluid. The company of other women doesn't generally make women tense. We don't have our guard up in the same way. We operate under different rules. Our territories, such as they are not hard and fast. We hug and touch and break the barriers of one another's space in ways that men find startling among themselves. Our hugs may be superficial, and they may not always be sincere, but they are not threatening. We may also be competitive and undermining at times, but even at our worst, the most we are likely to do is hurt one another's feelings. As a result, you don't often hear women talk about being afraid of other women, but these guys talk about fear all the time, as if exposing yourself to another man was like putting yourself under his knife. When I emerged from under the low lintel, Paul was standing there in the light, close enough to touch, with his arms wide open for a hug. Again, a symbolic act. You come up from below expecting a sucker punch, and instead you get a long lost father hug. I folded myself into Paul's chest defensively, worried that he would feel my bra underneath my flannel shirt or the stickiness of my beard. Welcome, Ned, he said, exhaling deeply and crushing me against him. Unexpectedly, I felt him soften in the embrace. It wasn't a bear hug. He didn't slap me on the back or grunt encouragement. He held me. He really held me. Unlike Gabriel's early hugs, we had felt faintly, which had felt faintly shallow and cloying. Paul's hug was real and generous. Here was the guy I'd been demonizing, fearing, disliking, and he was taking me in as a son. My guilt ratcheted up a notch. Paul often played the father figure in the group, and he played it expertly. The guys looked up to him a lot, but their respect had an edge to it too. Early in the evening, while constructing the tunnel and obstacles, Paul had shouted encouragement to two of the younger guys. Looks great, he said. Hey, quit one of them under his breath. Praise from Caesar. He meant it affectionately, but it was a jab too. He was right on the nose. Caesar indeed. Little Caesar. The emperor in a shoebox bloated with his own importance. I thought of him that way too, complete with the desire to betray him. But after our therapeutic talks in the previous week's meeting, and now after this hug, I felt ashamed of my former judgments. Like everyone else here, Paul was full of wounds, and he didn't share them easily. I had seen him early in the evening, sitting off by himself at one of the tables in the dining room, working up the next day's lesson plan. He had been leafing through some books of poetry and inserting bookmarks in the places he wanted to read them later. Then, at one point, very deliberately, he put the books down, stacking them into a small pile, crossed his arms around them, and rested his head on them. He sat like that for a while before I realized that he was crying. I had wanted to approach him then, to put my palm on the back of his neck and show him that someone was paying attention. But I still sensed a volatility in him that made me worry he might swing around and belt me, like a bear surprised at his last meal. Besides, my move would have been feminine, or at least have come from a nurturing place, and that stuff got a complicated reception in these parts where mothers were birds of prey. Fanned out in the room behind Paul, all the other guys who had gone through the tunnel before me were standing in a semicircular receiving line, each waiting for a hug from me. I hugged them all in turn, bristling, just as many of them did, at the forced physical intimacy with the stranger, but mostly for fear of being found out. That was the end of the initiation ritual, and I have to admit that I found the whole thing a little ridiculous. I knew what they were trying to do, and I respected the attempt. Blythe's preaching was full of paeans to rites and rituals, myths and symbolisms. The loss of them was crucial, he claimed, to the breakdown of modern masculinity. But to my mind, these insipid parlor games were no replacement, either often a genuine obstacle, a real trial that would test the limits of a person's character and sense of self, or leave it alone. But don't have them walk through a pump tent smelling like a cookout and expect them to find salvation at the other end. Wow. 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 That's crazy. That's crazy. Wow. The next morning after breakfast, we all gathered in front of the fire in the living room, and Paul handed out large pieces of sketch paper, one to each of us. He distributed crayons, pens, and markers as well. Then he asked us all to draw a picture of our inner hero. This had been the advertised theme of the weekend. Are you a hero? And if so, what kind? This had made me cringe when I first seen it written on the retreat literature. They can't be serious, I thought. But of course, I knew they were. Heroes and archetypes were straight out of Blythe's Bible. What does your hero look like? Paul asks. To get us in the right frame of mind, he mentioned John Wayne, Batman, the Lone Ranger, and Achilles as examples of archetypal y'all know what I'm saying, archetypal heroes. Was our hero like them? He asked, or something different? What was his quest? What was his mission? What was his Achilles heel? Gabriel began scribbling furiously with a black crayon. He'd been coming to these retreats for years, so I guess he was familiar with the procedure. His hero was right under the surface. Looking over his shoulder, I can see that he'd taken the Batman thing to heart, though he appeared to have hit on some messianic themes as well and was drawing a big cross on Batman's chest. Later, he would describe the character as Batman Jesus. When all the, I, on the other hand, was blocked. No, Smitty, you straight, bro. I appreciate you being here. I, on the other hand, was blocked. My sheet was blank. The freakish Joan of Arc doll that I loved so much in childhood sprang to mind, and I had to stifle a laugh. Somehow, I didn't think a cross-dressing peasant warrior woman would go over well in this crowd or do much for my cover, so I drew an atomic bomb instead. When all the guys had finished sketching and scribbling notes on their drawings, Paul asked some of us to share. And while several of the sketches were as absurd as Gabriel's, some of them were actually quite revealing and unexpectedly reflective of Ned's experience. Before this retreat, I hadn't had an opportunity to find out how many of Ned's feelings about his masculinity and his place in this world were real or imagined, a genuine part of masculine experience, or just the product of my female eyes filtering that experience. A guy named Corey was the first to share his drawing. I had just met him the previous evening. I have never seen him at the regular bi-monthly sessions. He said he didn't go to those anymore, but he always made it to the retreats. They seemed to do something important for him. In a way, he was the prototypical men's movement guy. He was a real education in hidden male fragility. To look at him, you'd think this guy had the world on a string, at least romantically. He carried himself like the accomplished athlete that he was, and he had a sculpted, perfect body whose every muscle was visible, practically even beneath his clothing. He reminded me of guys I seen in high school and college who always had legions of girls around them, all clamoring to be their next conquest. I used to look at guys like that and think, what must it be like to be that guy, a god among men? I got my answer. When we arrived at the lodge, we had all been assigned to sub-therapy groups of 4 or 5. In these, we were expected to convene over the course of the weekend to explore more intimately the things we discussed in the workshops. Corey and I were in the same group, and we hit it off right away. There was a ping pong table in a small room behind the living room fireplace, and we played a couple of games together. He was likable and easy, not the kind of guy you think was haunted by self-loathing and doubt, but he was. He shared his drawing eagerly. He called it Solo Warrior, and it was a picture of a guy who looked like a cross between Lancelot and Grizzly Adams. He was carrying a shield and a sword, and he'd been wandering in the forest for a very long time. He was out there, Corey explained, because he was an outcast, barred from entering the villages he came upon. Why can't he enter the village? Asked Paul. Because he's not good enough yet, said Corey. He needs to perfect his body. He needs to perfect himself before he can join civilization. And what's his Achilles heel? Corey paused. He's needy. He should be able to live alone bravely without help, but he can't. He wants love. He needs it. And it's that very need that makes him too imperfect to enter the village, asked Paul. Yeah, said Corey. Later in our small group, Corey talked more about himself. Sharing intimate therapeutic time with him and the rest of those guys shattered for me another of the stereotypes I always harbored about men. The idea that they don't talk about their relationships, especially not with each other. I'd always assumed that they weren't nearly as concerned as women are with the minutia of intimacy. But after listening to these guys, I thought it was probably truer to say that most guys had simply never had the opportunity or license to explore the subject. In our group, we spent the bulk of the time talking about their relationships, past and present. All of them were in relationships, and all of them felt concerned about and insecure in them, especially Corey. He had a beautiful girlfriend, he said, but it sounded as if he couldn't enjoy his time with her because he was constantly afraid of losing her to another guy, specifically another guy who made more money, a guy of higher social status. Guys were always buzzing around her, he said, and this drove him crazy, partly because she indulged in their attentions. Here he was, the outwardly powerful masculine ideal, an outcast in his own life, overly insecure. I don't know why she be using it. It's excruciatingly insecure in his position, compelled to make a brave show of it on the outside, forbidden to show weakness, yet plagued by it nonetheless. She could say so much more with so many less words. But it's her book, right? Thinking back on it, I wondered now how much I and every other girl in school had invested in worshiping guys like him from a distance, and how much sustaining our admiration, acting that part, had cost them. I suppose Corey symbolized a lot of what I thought I was going to find in manhood, or had envied in it. So much of what I and the culture at large had projected onto it. Privilege, confidence, power. And learning the truth about this pose, both firsthand as Ned and secondhand through Corey and these other guys' confessions, learning the truth about the burden of holding up that illusion of impregnability taught me an unforgettable lesson about the hidden pain of masculinity and my own sexist symbiotic role in it. When we needed men not to be needy, and so they weren't. But of course, ultimately, we did need and want them to be needy, to express their feelings and be vulnerable. And they needed that too. They needed permission to be weak and even to fail sometimes. But somewhere in there, the signals usually got crossed or lost altogether, which often left both men and women feeling unfulfilled, resentful, and alone. Corey wasn't the only physically imposing guy I met in the men's group, and he wasn't the only guy who had issues about it. Not just issues about vulnerability, romantic or otherwise, but specifically about body image. Most of us who grew up on women's studies knew intimately the struggles that we and most of our women friends have been through on this front. The body as a battleground, mutilation, objectification, violation. These were key words in the feminist vocabulary, and they still are. And that vocabulary was built on verifiable female experience. We saw ourselves in it because most of us had been on crash diets in our teens, obsessed about our noses, breast and ass sizes, our leg hair, our pubic hair, and our menstrual flow. Many of us had known or been anorexics or bulimics. Most of us couldn't think of a single female friend who hadn't been through a war with her own body. The truth of the claim was obvious. But likewise, most of us didn't know or didn't think we knew any guys who had the same problems. They ate what they wanted. They weren't ashamed of their fat. Most of them had none, or their body hair, or the way their jeans fit. We resented their insouciance. Yeah, insouciance. We resented their insouciance. To us, body issues were a woman's problem imposed by the culture of fashion, by men's rapacious eyes, of course, by the insidious product of the two, the beauty myth. It is 9:28. That's an hour of reading. We'll be back on Self next week on page 255. 255. Shout out to y'all. Again, thank y'all so much. Like the video, share the video if you think this will be helpful or entertaining for anybody or educational. And that's all I got. I ain't trying to keep y'all too long. I appreciate y'all for coming through for reading. It is the book club. And I want to thank y'all for coming out. Y'all have a great night. Be safe. Shout out to my boy Tap. He's the sponsor of the show with that $10. $10 may ya holla. Super chat. I appreciate you, bro. And that's all we got, man. Y'all be safe. Y'all have a great night. Make sure y'all have your notifications on. Check the community posts. We got some stuff coming. Again, laptop giving away. Laptop give it away. Brand new laptop give it away. You got to be a sub and hit a win. So thank y'all so much for y'all time. If y'all feel like supporting the channel, again, super chats are always welcome. And I do have a Cash App, $RDUB, says $AREDUBBZ. And I appreciate y'all. Y'all have a great night. Be safe. Love who loves you. Take care of yourself first, because if you were not here to see it, this universe would not exist. Y'all have a great night. Peace.